How did Joseph of Egypt die? Shocking truth after his death. What really happened to Joseph, the dreamer who rose from a prison to the palace of Pharaoh? His life was miraculous. But what about his death? Hidden in ancient texts is a truth so shocking it was almost forgotten. Let's uncover the mystery that history refused to tell. Joseph's final years in Egypt. Joseph, once a Hebrew slave, became the second most powerful man in Egypt. He had saved not only the Egyptians, but also his own family during a devastating famine. After Jacob's death, Joseph remained in Egypt, living in honor, wealth, and great respect. But there's something strange. Despite all this, Joseph never left Egypt. Why? Joseph lived 110 years, considered a full life by Egyptian standards. He saw 3 generations of his descendants. But even with all the comfort, he never called Egypt his final home. Why? Because deep in his heart, he remembered God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that their people would one day return to the Promised Land. Joseph was in Egypt, but his soul longed for Canaan. When Joseph felt his end approaching, he did something strange yet deeply prophetic. He gathered his brothers and said something powerful. God will surely come to your aid, and you must carry my bones up from this place. Genesis 50:25. Why did Joseph ask for his bones to be carried out of Egypt? Because he did not want to be buried permanently in a land of slavery. He wanted to be part of God's greater plan, even in death. His request wasn't just symbolic, it became a prophetic act of faith. He believed Israel would be delivered one day. That's why he didn't want to be buried in a grand Egyptian tomb like other officials. Instead, his body was preserved, waiting for a future moment of redemption. But how was his body preserved? Was it mummified like the pharaohs? What happened to it during the centuries of slavery? That's where the story gets even more mysterious. After Joseph's death, Egypt saw the rise and fall of many dynasties, and his bones were stored in a coffin, an item of deep significance in Egyptian culture. But here's where it gets intriguing. Joseph's bones were kept safe, waiting for the day his descendants would return to the Promised Land. The journey of Joseph's bones was, in itself, a story filled with meaning and faith. For 400 years, his bones sat in Egypt as the Israelites were enslaved. No one dared move them, not even in the chaos of the Egyptian empire. But God's promises never fail. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, one of the most significant tasks on their journey was to take the bones of Joseph. Exodus 13 verse 19 says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. The Israelites were leaving Egypt, but Joseph's bones symbolized more than just a physical journey. They represented the hope of deliverance. When Moses gathered the Israelites to leave, it wasn't just about leaving the land of slavery. It was about stepping into the promise God had made to their forefathers. So Moses made sure Joseph's bones were taken along, symbolizing a covenant fulfilled, that the people would one day return to their land, just as Joseph had prophesied. But the journey wasn't as simple as it seemed. Joseph's bones weren't just a physical object to be carried from one place to another. They represented the ongoing faith of a people in a God who fulfills his promises. The bones of Joseph symbolized the hope of a future, not only the fulfillment of God's promise to return to Canaan, but also the ultimate redemption of the people of Israel. For the Israelites, the act of carrying Joseph's bones was a deep spiritual act. It wasn't simply about a physical journey, it was a journey of faith, faith in a promise that had been made hundreds of years before. As the Israelites carried Joseph's bones through the desert, they were reminded of God's faithfulness through every hardship. In many ways, Joseph's bones were a silent witness to everything the Israelites had endured. It was a tangible reminder that God was with them, and he would never leave them nor forsake them. Each step in their journey, carrying Joseph's bones, was a step closer to the fulfillment of God's promise. After wandering the desert for 40 years, the Israelites finally stood on the edge of the Promised Land. It was time for them to cross the Jordan River into the land that had been promised to their ancestors. But before they did, they had one final symbolic act to complete. Joseph's bones needed to be buried in the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This would be a full circle moment. When they crossed the Jordan River and entered Canaan, they made their way to a place called Shechem, in the land of Ephraim. There, Joseph's bones were finally laid to rest in the plot of land his father Jacob had bought many years before, as recorded in Joshua 24:32. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. It was a significant moment. Joseph, who had saved the Israelites, had lived out God's plan through his trials and triumphs. His final resting place was a testimony to God's enduring faithfulness, fulfilling the promise he made to his father Jacob and continuing the lineage of the covenant. But the burial of Joseph also had deeper significance. It represented not just the end of one life, but the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise. Joseph's death and the carrying of his bones weren't just about his physical remains, it was about a spiritual legacy. The end of an era, the beginning of a new promise. Joseph's burial in Shechem marked the end of an era. It was the end of a time when the Israelites were under the protection of Egypt, a time of both prosperity and struggle. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in their history. The Israelites were finally in the land of their ancestors. They could now fully establish themselves as the people of God. And Joseph's bones, now laid to rest, served as the symbolic anchor for this new phase in Israel's history. The promise of the land was finally realized, and the Israelites were now called to build their nation, following the covenant they had with God. Joseph's bones were no longer a physical object they carried, but a spiritual legacy that would live on through the generations. Joseph's journey from the pit to the palace had been a story of personal redemption, but his story didn't end there. His bones, carried by the Israelites, continued to testify to the faithfulness of God. It was as though Joseph himself was saying, "Even in death, God's promises are true, and he will always come to your aid." So what is the lasting message from Joseph's bones for us today? First, it's a reminder that God's promises are never forgotten. No matter how long it takes, no matter how dark the night, God will always fulfill his word. Joseph's request to have his bones carried out of Egypt wasn't a request for comfort. It was a symbol of faith. His life and even his death was a testament to the importance of trusting God, even when things seem impossible. In our own lives, we too might experience times when we feel far from our true home, when we feel like we're trapped in a land of Egypt. But just like Joseph, we are called to remember the promises of God. Even in the darkest moments, we are called to trust that God is with us and that he has a plan for us. Joseph's life and death remind us of several important lessons. 1. Faith in God's plan. Joseph never wavered in his faith, even through trials. His story teaches us that even when things seem bleak, God's plan is always better. 2. Trust in God's timing. The promise Joseph made about his bones didn't come to pass immediately, but it was fulfilled in God's perfect timing. 3. Hope beyond the grave. Joseph's bones didn't stay buried in Egypt because he had hope that God's promises would come true. Just like Joseph, we should have hope beyond the grave, knowing that God will always fulfill his promises. Overall lesson: Joseph's bones symbolize much more than just his life. They're a testimony to God's unchanging faithfulness. In life and death, Joseph trusted in God's promise, and his story teaches us to do the same. Never lose faith, because God will always come through. If you found this deep dive into Joseph's life and death fascinating, don't forget to subscribe for more. Join us on our journey through the mysteries of the Bible. Stay tuned for the next video.